Thanksgiving was supposed to be a night of gratitude and warmth, but that evening in Ohio, the smell of roasted turkey pumpkin pie and cinnamon candles mixed with something I will never forget. The sound of my mother-in-law, Margaret, looking me directly in the eye across the dinner table and calling me trash. I had just paid $3,000 out of my own pocket to cover what Medicare did not cover for her gallbladder surgery money. I had been saving slowly from my job as an accounting assistant at a small local office, money I had thought about setting aside for my future education and maybe even fertility treatment someday. I carried that hospital receipt in my purse, like a reminder that I had stepped in when her own husband Victor, her sons Caleb and Troy, and even her church friends had all made excuses about how expensive the hospital was, how the insurance would not cover the extras, how they were too busy to manage paperwork. I had handled every phone call with the billing department. I had spoken with the insurance rep who explained that Medicare would only cover the standard procedure, but not the private room and recovery care. I had gone online at midnight to make sure the account balance was cleared before she was discharged. I believed that by doing this, I had shown her and the entire Miller family that I was part of them, that I deserved to be there. But as the plates of mashed potatoes and cranberry sauce were passed around and the Dallas Cowboys game hummed on the television in the background, Margaret leaned forward in her cardigan and pearls and delivered her judgment like a sentence. "You think money makes you worthy. You are nothing but trash." She said it in the same tone one would use to scrape mud off a shoe. My husband Caleb smirked nervously and looked down at his plate instead of defending me. His younger brother Troy, already sipping beer, though he was barely 22, let out a loud laugh and clapped his hands as if it were the best joke of the night. Victor the patriarch kept his expression flat, chewing his turkey slowly, as if nothing had been said at all. My face burned, my throat closed, and for 1 second I thought I might shout, might slam my fork down, might demand that they acknowledge the cruelty of what had just been done. But the silence around me was heavier than my voice. Even the clinking of silverware stopped. In that silence, I understood something that years of compromise had tried to hide. To them, I was not a wife, not a daughter-in-law, not family. I was an outsider who had bought my way into their house by covering bills and cleaning up messes. They had never loved me. They had tolerated me because I was useful. And now, in front of everyone, Margaret had stripped away even that illusion. She had called me trash and no one had objected. I cleared my throat and forced myself not to cry. I forced my hand to move to pick up plates one by one to scrape leftover green beans into the bin. I let my silence be the only answer because I knew that tears would only give them satisfaction. Inside me, however, something snapped. I remembered the long nights balancing their Duke energy bills, negotiating late fees, organizing Victor's contractor receipts so he could claim deductions he did not deserve. I remembered every time Caleb had shrugged when I asked him to stand up for me. I remembered thinking that maybe if I just worked harder, if I just proved myself, they would finally respect me. That Thanksgiving night showed me the truth. Respect was never on the table, only contempt, only control. I carried the plates into the kitchen with hands that shook not from weakness but from rage caged too long. As I rolled the trash bin forward, I thought of the word she had just spit at me and realized it was no longer an insult. It was a key. Trash can be taken out, removed, gone. And that is exactly what I was about to become. When I placed the last plate in the sink and heard the family laughter resume behind me, I knew I would never beg for a seat at their table again. That was the moment my marriage began to end, the moment my silence transformed into a weapon sharper than any word I could have said. I was only 20, but my life already felt older than it should have, shaped by long shifts, night classes, and compromises that drained me more than they should have. I had grown up in Columbus, Ohio, the daughter of a truck driver who spent weeks on the road and a mother who worked the late shift as a cashier at Walmart. My parents never had much, but they raised me to speak up, to work hard, and to never let anyone treat me like I was less. I had carried those lessons with me when I enrolled at Columbus Community College, studying accounting, part-time, determined to build a future where money would not control me the way it had controlled them. To help pay tuition, I worked as an assistant in a small CPA office that handled taxes for local businesses like nail salons, garages, and diners. It was there I learned to read IRS forms to see how deductions could be manipulated and to notice when numbers did not match receipts. That knowledge would later become both my shield and my sword. When I met Caleb at 19, he was working in a warehouse at the Amazon Fulfillment Center outside town. He was handsome in a plain way with tired eyes from night shifts and a smile that made me believe he was kind. He told me he admired my ambition, that he wanted a woman who could keep him grounded. We married quickly, too quickly, and I thought love would be enough to balance out our differences. But marrying Caleb meant marrying his family. The Millers lived in a single-story house on the edge of town with a sagging porch and a big truck parked out front. Inside, the walls were covered with family portraits that always placed Margaret in the center, perfectly coiffed, smiling like she was queen of the neighborhood. Victor, her husband, owned a small construction company that had been around for decades. People in town respected him as a businessman, but I noticed immediately how sloppy his records were, how invoices were written in pencil, how subcontractor payments were stuffed into envelopes with no receipts. He liked to present himself as a solid Baptist churchgoer, attending every Sunday service at the local church, but I saw the hypocrisy in the way he dismissed rules at home. Troy, the youngest son, was 22 and still living in his parents' basement, skipping between community jobs he never kept, and spending most nights gaming loudly until dawn. He was the kind of man Margaret still coddled, bringing him plates of food while calling me lazy if I ever sat down. And then there was Margaret herself, the sharp tongue, the cold smile, the real ruler of that household. She had been in charge of the Baptist Church Women's Fund for years, organizing bake sales and charity drives, acting as if she were generous, but behind closed doors, she was cruel. She believed a woman's place was in the kitchen, that wives should be grateful to serve, and she hated that I was still in school, hated that I had opinions about money, hated that I could see through her control. She once told Caleb within my hearing that he had not married a wife but a manager. Caleb laughed nervously, never correcting her, never defending me. That was the way of our marriage. He was silent when silence protected them, and his silence hurt me more than their insults. At first, I convinced myself it was culture that I could bend, that I could be patient until they learned to accept me. But the longer I lived under their gaze, the more I understood they would never see me as anything but a tool. I was the one who organized their bills, who remembered their mortgage due dates, who fixed the Wi-Fi router, who kept track of Victor's scattered invoices. And they repaid me with smirks and whispers and sharp words. The Thanksgiving night when Margaret called me trash was not the first time she cut me down, but it was the first time she did it so directly, so publicly, and with everyone else laughing or staying silent. That is why it shattered something inside me. Because in that moment, I saw clearly the people I had married into people who thrived on control, people who would never love me for me. Living with the Millers was like living under a constant spotlight where every word, every gesture, every silence was judged. Margaret had a way of making me feel small without raising her voice, a constant drip of contempt disguised as advice. She would lean over the counter while I cooked and say that real wives did not measure ingredients they felt them, implying I was robotic and cold. She would remind me that community college was not a real school, that while I was busy with night classes, other women my age were already raising children. Caleb absorbed her comments like wallpaper, never arguing, never supporting me, and sometimes repeating her words as if they were his own. The first time he ever put his hand on me, it was not a closed fist, not a blow that left a bruise, but a quick slap across my cheek when I said I wanted to keep the extra money I had earned from overtime at the CPA office for my tuition instead of putting it into the joint account. It shocked me more because he looked embarrassed after mumbling that I had pushed him too far. But later that night, he let his mother Margaret scold me for being selfish. That was the moment I realized silence was not just passivity in this family, it was complicity. Victor was different, less vocal, but more dangerous in his own way. He did not insult me directly, but his presence filled the house like smoke. He would sit in his recliner after long days at the construction site, sipping from a glass, and watch me move around as if I were invisible. Yet, whenever tax season came, he would suddenly call me into his study, spread out piles of contractor receipts on the desk, and expect me to sort them. He knew I worked in an accounting office, he knew I could read forms, and he used that knowledge without ever acknowledging it. He would mutter about deductions, about how the IRS never checked small businesses like his, about how he needed me to make it look tidy. I was 20 years old, and yet I carried the burden of organizing ledgers for a 55-year-old man who had built his business on cutting corners. When I asked Caleb if this was fair, he shrugged and said his father was too busy to deal with paperwork. In that shrug, I saw the pattern of his life, a man raised never to stand up to the people who fed him. Troy, the youngest, treated me with open disdain. He would mock the way I packed my textbooks into my bag, calling me a nerd, laughing that I was wasting money on school when his parents provided food and shelter for free. He bragged about skipping shifts at the car wash, about playing video games until dawn, and Margaret would pat his shoulder and call him her baby. The double standard was suffocating. I was expected to manage bills, cook meals, keep the household running smoothly, and yet I was the one constantly told I was not enough. I began to notice how control seeped into every corner of our marriage. Margaret insisted on Sunday dinners where she chose the menu, where my role was to serve quietly. Victor insisted the TV remain tuned to his sports, even if others wanted something else. Caleb insisted that I should not complain because marriage was about compromise, but compromise always meant me bending me, giving me swallowing words. The psychological weight grew heavier with each passing day until I felt like I was losing myself. The cruelest part was that I began to believe them. I began to wonder if maybe I was too direct, too stubborn, too proud. But deep down, another part of me resisted a part shaped by my parents' lessons, a part that whispered that respect was not something you earned by sacrificing your dignity. That inner voice grew louder every time Margaret delivered another insult, every time Caleb looked away instead of standing by me, every time Victor handed me a pile of questionable receipts. By the time Thanksgiving arrived, I was already cracked inside, but I still clung to the hope that kindness, that sacrifice, that paying $3,000 would change something. Instead, Margaret's words proved the truth I had avoided for too long. To them, I was never family, only a tool to be used and discarded. The $3,000 I spent on Margaret's gallbladder surgery had not come easily. For months, I had been skipping coffee runs with classmates, working extra hours at the CPA office, even tutoring other students at Columbus Community College just to put money aside. I had a dream of saving enough for an IVF consultation at Cleveland Clinic one day, because Caleb and I had talked about children, and though I was only 20, I wanted to prepare early since I knew medical costs in America could crush anyone who waited too long. When Margaret was admitted to the hospital, she acted as if the government would take care of everything, but the truth was Medicare only covered the standard procedure and not the recovery suite her doctor insisted would help prevent infection. The bill arrived with a note that if the balance was not cleared before discharge, the hospital would place her in a shared ward. Caleb told me he did not have the money. Victor said his accounts were tied up. Troy shrugged, and Margaret herself refused to touch her savings. I looked at the total $3,000 and felt the weight of my dreams slide into the background as I pulled out my debit card. I told myself that this would prove to them I was committed, that they would see me as a daughter not by blood but by loyalty. I sat in the waiting room smelling antiseptic and coffee from vending machines, watching the payment process on my phone, believing that I was securing my place. In the days that followed, I visited Margaret, brought her soup, managed her medication schedule, and even dealt with the insurance representative who called to confirm coverage. Margaret barely looked at me, but I convinced myself that gratitude might come later. I told myself that at Thanksgiving, she would surely acknowledge the sacrifice, that around the table with turkey and pies, she would say something kind. Instead, as I set down the basket of rolls and tried to smile, she cut through the air with her words. "You think money makes you worthy. You are nothing but trash." The words were clear, slow, deliberate, delivered with the kind of venom that leaves no space for misunderstanding. Caleb looked away, his fork frozen. Troy laughed. Victor chewed calmly. "No one defended me." My cheeks burned as if I had been slapped, my chest tightened, but I forced myself not to cry. Crying would have given them satisfaction. Instead, I stood silently, collected the plates one by one, and carried them to the kitchen as if I were invisible. The humiliation sank deep because it was not just her words, but the silence of everyone else. I realized then that my sacrifice meant nothing. The $3,000 had not bought me respect. It had bought me contempt. They saw generosity as weakness, and they mocked me for it. That realization twisted in my stomach as I scraped food into the bin, hearing their laughter resume behind me. The meal that should have symbolized family had become proof that I was alone in a house full of people. The public humiliation was worse than any private insult because it stripped away the last illusion that love or loyalty could win them over. My sacrifice had been transformed into evidence that I could be used, and in their eyes that made me less, not more. Standing in that kitchen, I felt the shift inside me. I would never sacrifice like that for them again. That night, after the humiliation at the Thanksgiving table, I did not drive home with Caleb. I did not crawl back into the bed that smelled of his silence. Instead, I drove down Interstate 71 until the Miller house was a blur in the rearview mirror and checked into a cheap roadside motel with flickering neon lights and thin towels. The room smelled of bleach and cigarettes, but it gave me the distance I needed to breathe. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the word trash echo in my head, and I decided that I would never again beg for space at their table. My silence would no longer be compliance, it would be strategy. The next morning, I opened my Huntington Bank app and rerouted my direct deposit from the joint account into a new savings account I had opened quietly in my own name months earlier. I withdrew enough cash to cover my tuition and stashed it in an envelope under my pillow. Then I logged into Victor's construction business email, where he had once added me as a helper during tax season. He had forgotten to revoke my access, and I knew exactly where the invoices were stored. Sloppy scans of contractor receipts, handwritten notes about cash payments, numbers that never matched the deposits I had seen on the Fifth Third bank statements he left on his desk. My work at the CPA office had taught me what red flags looked like, and Victor's business was drowning in them. For 2 years, I had cleaned up his papers, entered figures into spreadsheets, and made everything look neat without signing anything official. I had copies of the ledgers on a flash drive, evidence of deductions that were not legitimate of subcontractor expenses that had never been paid of checks written to shell names. That morning, I backed up the files again, saving them onto a second drive I purchased at a gas station. I called my sister Linda, a nurse at Cleveland Clinic who had seen too many women broken by toxic families, and told her I could not stay silent anymore. She told me to document everything to keep my money separate and to protect myself first. Her voice was calm, steady, and it anchored me. Over the next few days, I moved carefully, still showing up at the CPA office, still attending night classes, but keeping my distance from Caleb. He texted me asking where I was, saying his mother was worried, but I ignored him. My silence unsettled them more than words ever could. At night in the motel, I spread out papers on the bed, receipts, statements, copies of Victor's handwritten ledgers, building a map of corruption. I did not need to invent anything. The truth was enough. For the first time, I felt control shifting into my hands. It was not loud, it was not violent, but it was powerful. They had called me trash, and now I was going to show them what trash could do when it stopped playing by their rules. I knew I could not confront them directly yet. The Millers thrived on yelling and intimidation, and I would lose in that arena. My resistance would be silent, precise, and timed. Every choice I made was a brick in the wall I was building between me and them. By the time Caleb realized what was happening, it would be too late. It did not take long for the silence to turn into ripples that shook the Miller house. A week after Thanksgiving, Victor received a letter from the IRS, the kind printed on government paper with the seal in the corner and a code that ordinary people would ignore, but I recognized instantly from my work at the CPA office. It was a letter 2205, AA, notice that his small construction company had been selected for audit, and I could imagine the look on his face when he unfolded it at the kitchen table. That morning, Caleb showed up at the motel parking lot, leaning against his truck with arms crossed, looking less like a husband and more like a man on assignment. He asked me why the IRS was sniffing around, his tone sharp, as if I owed him an explanation. I looked at him and saw the same silence that had once been weakness, now turning into accusation. He said his father was stressed his mother could not sleep, that Troy thought someone had hexed the house. I listened without flinching. When he accused me of tearing the family apart, I asked him a single question, the one that had haunted me since Thanksgiving. Why did you laugh when your mother called me trash? His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked down, kicked at the gravel, and for the first time he realized silence could condemn him too. Meanwhile, Margaret's calls became more frequent and more venomous. She left voicemails telling me I had embarrassed them in front of the church, that everyone was talking, that if I had any decency, I would fix what I had broken. Her fury told me that the investigation was no longer a rumor, it was real, and the community had started whispering. At the CPA office, I overheard clients discussing how Victor's company was under review, how maybe the Millers were not as untouchable as they claimed. The more the tension grew, the more I stayed still, and that stillness drove them mad. Troy Drunk dialed me one night, slurring that he always liked me better than his brother, and that I should have married a man with a spine. He rambled about how his parents had duct-taped the Ring camera at the front door, how Victor kept a baseball bat by the entrance, how Margaret was burning sage in the kitchen because she thought evil spirits were circling the house. I said nothing, only listened, and every detail confirmed that fear had begun to rot their foundation. What they did not know was that I had already spoken to Rachel Klein, the tax attorney recommended by my boss at the CPA office. I had given her copies of Victor's ledgers, invoices, and mismatched statements. She told me the case was strong, that the IRS would not stop at surface numbers once they saw the depth of inconsistencies. The Millers thought they were being haunted, but the only ghost in their house was the truth, a truth they had buried for years and which now walked freely in daylight. I did not need to scream or argue. The more they panicked, the more obvious their guilt became. Margaret called me one last time, her voice shaking with rage, demanding to know if I had betrayed them. I answered calmly that I had only done what they taught me to keep records, to be organized, to be useful. Then I hung up. Their fear was growing, and I knew it was only the beginning. The more the investigation deepened, the clearer it became that the Miller family had been living on a foundation of lies for years, and now every crack was widening. I had passed the USB drive to Rachel Klein, my attorney, and on it were Victor's handwritten ledgers receipts that contradicted bank deposits and files of subcontractor payments that had never been reported. Rachel explained that these were not small mistakes, they were patterns, and once the IRS cross-checked the numbers against the Fifth Third bank accounts, the discrepancies would light up like red flags. I sat in her office across from the shelves lined with law books as she outlined how this kind of audit would move forward, starting with letters, then interviews, then demands for documents. She assured me that because I had never signed the forms, I was not liable. I had only been the one cleaning up the mess. For the first time since marrying Caleb, I felt the weight shifting off my shoulders. A week later, the Columbus Dispatch printed a small story tucked inside the business section, local contractor under IRS audit. It was only a few paragraphs long, but in a town like ours, it spread faster than wildfire. At the Baptist church that Sunday, people whispered in the pews, glancing at Margaret with eyes that used to respect her and now carried suspicion. She sat stiff in her floral dress, clutching her Bible, pretending not to hear, but I knew she felt the sting. Victor did not show his face at service at all. That afternoon, Caleb tracked me down again, this time outside the CPA office as I locked up for the night. His face was pale, his hands shoved into his hoodie pockets. He asked me if I had done this, if I had handed over his father's business records. I looked at him and told him I had only kept copies of the truth. He said his father was furious his mother was falling apart and that the IRS wanted access to years of statements. I could see the fear in his eyes because he knew what was buried in those numbers. Meanwhile, Troy kept calling late at night, drunk, spilling details he thought would scare me. He said his mother had started accusing Victor of hiding even more, that boxes of old receipts were pulled out of the garage, that they were shredding papers and burning old files in the backyard fire pit. His words did not frighten me. They confirmed that panic had taken over. I remained silent, collecting every voicemail, every message, and storing them on my own drive. When Margaret finally called me directly, she did not sound powerful, she sounded desperate. She begged me to help to talk to the IRS to explain that mistakes were clerical. I reminded her of Thanksgiving night, of the words she had used to define me, and I asked her if trash could really save them now. She hung up without answering. The pressure inside that family was boiling, and I knew the lid would blow off soon. Rachel told me to stay calm, that the IRS would eventually uncover not only unreported income, but also the trust Victor had tried to keep hidden, a trust set up in his name with Caleb and Troy as beneficiaries. That trust had never been declared on tax forms, and if it came into the light, it would not only implicate Victor, but also expose both sons. The irony was that the very documents Victor once forced me to organize were now the same ones pulling him down. It was not revenge built on lies, it was simply their own truth finally dragging them under. As the weeks passed, the Millers began to unravel in public. Margaret no longer showed her face at church. Victor stopped driving his big truck around town. Caleb avoided eye contact with neighbors, and Troy vanished into the basement. Their empire of respectability was collapsing, and all I had done was hand the world the evidence they themselves had created. The collapse of the Miller family's reputation did not happen. In whispers alone, it exploded in front of the very community they had ruled for years, and I was there to witness it with the same silence that had once been my prison, but was now my weapon. It began with the Columbus Dispatch running a follow-up article about the IRS audit this time, with more detail naming Victor Miller's construction business directly, and citing sources that claimed unreported income had been discovered. The article spread quickly because in small towns, news travels like fire in dry grass, and by the next Sunday, the Baptist Church Fellowship Hall was filled not only with parishioners, but with neighbors, contractors, and families who had once done business with Victor. The church leadership called a community meeting to address concerns because donations had dropped and whispers about financial impropriety were beginning to taint the church itself since Margaret had overseen women's fundraising efforts for years. I entered the hall quietly sitting near the back, but people noticed me immediately. I felt their eyes not hostile but curious, as if they had already pieced together that my absence from the Miller household was linked to the scandal unraveling in town. Margaret walked in wearing her best pearl necklace and a stiff smile that cracked as soon as she realized the room was not going to greet her with admiration. Victor trailed behind, shoulders slumped a shadow of the proud contractor he once pretended to be. Caleb was with them pale and gaunt, while Troy dragged his feet like a sulking child. The pastor cleared his throat, read a passage about honesty and stewardship, then opened the floor to questions. The first came from a woman whose husband had subcontracted under Victor and never been paid in full. The second came from a deacon who asked directly whether the IRS allegations were true. Murmurs swelled until Margaret snapped her voice, rising above the crowd, accusing everyone of betrayal, insisting that the family was being slandered by bitter outsiders. Then her eyes locked on me, sitting still in the back row, and she pointed with a trembling hand. "This is her doing," she spat. "She has been poisoning us. She is the reason the IRS is tearing us apart." The entire room turned to look at me. I stood slowly, my heart pounding, but my voice calm. I did not raise it. I did not argue. I simply said, "The truth is already out there." That was all, but it was enough. Because the truth did not need embellishment, it was written in the ledgers in the mismatched receipts, in the government letters that had already reached their mailbox. The silence that followed was heavy, and for the first time, Margaret's power broke under its weight. She screamed at me words, tumbling into anger, accusing me of being ungrateful, of being trash again. But now the community did not laugh, they recoiled. People who had once nodded politely at her now shook their heads. Victor tried to speak, but his voice cracked, muttering about misunderstandings, about accountants making errors. But Rachel... My attorney was also in the hall, and she stepped forward, introducing herself calmly. She explained that evidence had already been submitted to federal authorities, that this was not gossip, but documented fact. The pastor raised his hand to quiet the room, and in that silence, the Miller family looked smaller than I had ever seen them. Margaret's face was red. Victor's hands shook. Caleb stared at the floor, and Troy muttered curses under his breath. I felt no need to add more because the crowd had already judged them. Public shame is a powerful justice in small towns, and on that day, the Miller family faced it in full. As the meeting ended, people approached me, some quietly offering words of support, others shaking their heads at the Millers, and I walked out of the fellowship hall into crisp November air, knowing that the shift was irreversible. I had not screamed, I had not thrown plates, I had simply stood my ground with the truth, and that truth had dismantled their armor in front of everyone they had once controlled. For Margaret, humiliation was unbearable, and her shrieks that day would echo in the memory of every neighbor. For me, it was the beginning of freedom, because once shame is public, there is no going back. The Millers could never again pretend to be respectable pillars of the community. They had been unmasked, and I had been vindicated not by revenge built on lies, but by revenge carved from their own corruption displayed under the light of day. The weeks after the church meeting carved the Miller name into something no one wanted to touch, and the consequences landed one by one like hammers striking an already fractured wall. Victor was the first to face the official fallout when the IRS expanded the audit into a full-scale investigation, combing through more than a decade of his construction business records. They found unreported income from subcontractors' cash payments that had never been declared vehicles, registered under shell names, and even a hidden trust account that was supposed to benefit Caleb and Troy. The penalties were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars in back taxes, interest, and fines. Victor's company was effectively shut down, his contractor license revoked, and the bank repossessed his truck. The house that Margaret had decorated with pride was seized and sold at auction to cover debts. By the end of it, Victor and Margaret were forced to rent a small one-bedroom apartment on the third floor of an aging brick complex with no elevator, forcing Victor to struggle up the stairs each day. The man who once sat at his recliner like a king was now reduced to gasping for breath while neighbors carried groceries past him. Caleb, tied to the trust and implicated by the audit, faced his own judgment. The court granted him probation, an 18-month suspended sentence, and a felony record that branded him for life. He lost his job at the Amazon Fulfillment Center when the background check flagged him, and every new application was denied before he even had the chance to interview. Creditors refused him, friends avoided him, and in a town where word spread fast, he became a cautionary tale of wasted youth and blind loyalty to family. He sent me emails late at night, bitter words claiming I had destroyed his future, but I never replied. It was not me who had destroyed him. It was the silence he had chosen when his mother insulted me, the silence he had chosen when his father cheated taxes, the silence that had become his prison. Margaret's punishment came not from the IRS, but from the community she had once controlled. The Baptist Church stripped her of her leadership role in the Women's Fund after members voted her out. Old friends who used to sit with her at luncheons crossed the street to avoid her, and when she tried to attend Sunday service, the pastor's sermon on honesty and humility made her shift uncomfortably in her seat as eyes pierced her from every direction. Humiliation aged her faster than years of stress had ever done. Her hair thinned, her shoulders hunched, and the woman who once sneered at me with superiority now shuffled through grocery aisles with coupons no longer recognized as the queen of the town, but pitied as the fallen matriarch of a disgraced family. Troy's downfall was quieter but just as complete. He lost the possibility of inheritance when the trust was seized. His girlfriend left him after realizing the Miller name carried only debt and shame, and he sank deeper into the basement of his parents' rented apartment, living off fast food and cheap beer. The video games that once brought him distraction became chains as he avoided daylight, unable to face a world that no longer gave him the protection of his father's business or his mother's reputation. The Millers as a family became poison. Contractors refused to work with them, the church whispered about them, and their name was spoken only in hushed tones as a warning. They had built a life on control, contempt, and silence, and now the silence they once used against me became the silence of neighbors who wanted nothing to do with them. Meanwhile, I rebuilt my own life piece by piece, feeling each consequence they endured as both justice and closure. Every fine Victor paid was a reminder that my nights organizing his receipts had not been wasted. Every door slammed in Caleb's face was proof that laughter at my humiliation had cost him dearly. Every cold shoulder Margaret received at church was repayment for every cruel word she had spat at me. The consequences were not dramatic explosions, but steady, grinding losses that stripped them of power, pride, and place. And while they dwindled, I stood taller, not because I shouted them down, but because I had trusted the truth to do what it always does when given time. It exposes it, punishes it, frees. When the dust finally settled and the Miller family faded from the gossip of the town, I felt the first breath of freedom that belonged entirely to me. I filed for divorce, and the court granted it without delay, recognizing the financial abuse and the toxic environment I had endured. I left behind the old house, the mortgage, the poisoned name, and moved into a small apartment in Columbus, closer to my sister Linda. She welcomed me with open arms, her steady nurse's presence, a comfort that reminded me of the family I had always deserved. I continued my classes at Columbus Community College, pouring myself into accounting, with a determination sharpened by everything I had lived through. At night, I worked part-time at a CPA office downtown, the kind of steady job that promised a future built on my own terms. Each paycheck went into my personal savings untouched by anyone else's hands, and for the first time, I could look at my bank app without fear. The echoes of Margaret's voice still haunted me sometimes, but instead of pain, it brought clarity. She had called me trash because she believed kindness was weakness, and in doing so, she revealed her own emptiness. Caleb's silence, Victor's corruption, Troy's laziness. All of it had been exposed, and none of it could touch me anymore. What remained was my choice of how to live, and I chose peace. I started walking to class each morning, coffee in hand, smiling at the simple freedom of being able to make my own schedule without waiting for someone else's approval. I joined a study group with classmates who valued my insight, who respected me for my work, not for the bills I paid. I even began tutoring younger students, helping them understand the same tax forms I had once used to protect myself. Slowly, my identity shifted from victim to survivor, from outsider to independent woman carving her own path. The turning point came when I gathered the hospital receipt from Margaret's surgery, the same $3,000 that had sparked everything, and placed it in an envelope along with a handwritten note. I drove across town to a local women's shelter, a safe haven for those escaping abusive homes, and handed the envelope to the receptionist. "Give this to someone who knows the value of love. Not control," I wrote. It was my final act of release, taking the sacrifice that had once been twisted into humiliation and transforming it into hope for someone else. The woman at the desk looked at me with gratitude, and in that moment I felt lighter than I had in years. News of the Millers still surfaced occasionally. Whispers about Victor struggling with fines, Margaret shrinking into the background at church, Caleb drifting from one failed job to another, Troy sinking deeper into obscurity. But those whispers no longer defined me, they defined them. My life was no longer attached to theirs. I had become a name separate from their shame, and that separation was the truest justice of all. Standing outside the shelter, crisp winter air biting my cheeks, I realized that the story had never really been about revenge. It had been about reclaiming the voice they tried to silence, about turning the insult meant to break me into the beginning of my strength. I had survived humiliation, gaslighting, and control, and I had answered not with violence, but with truth, patience, and resilience. For the first time in years, I felt proud of myself without needing anyone's approval. I walked forward into the rest of my life not as trash, not as an outsider, but as Sophia Miller, no longer bound by the Miller family's chains. And as I looked toward the horizon of my future, I knew that dignity reclaimed is the most unshakable foundation a person can ever build.